very simply, I start the podcast with welcome to the Erasing Shame podcast. I'm joined with my dear, dear friends, David Park, the one that's here in Atlanta. I know that's a very common name, and you'll get to know him as we chat around the coffee table. We're having coffee, but it's not actually a coffee table. It's a folding table. We're in the basement of Dr. Stan Sonu, the other guest in our conversation on this episode. Thank you, Stan, for hosting. Thank you, David, for joining me on this collaboration.
Thanks, DJ. It's great to be here.
And this is a collaboration podcast for Erasing Shame and for AACNA. What does that stand for?
AACNA stands for Asian American Christian Network of Atlanta. And that's a network of church leaders and also lay people who care about the church here in Atlanta to be the body of Christ.
Okay, so let's start personal, and then we'll touch on our organizations, and then we'll dig into the collision of faith and culture.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I think that's more than 2 hours conversation, but we'll see how far we get.
So individual.
So okay, around this table, who knows each other the longest? People like origin stories. So how do we know each other?
Probably David and I.
Yeah?
David and me.
Yeah, I met Stan.
Both grew up in Atlanta?
No, I didn't grow up in Atlanta.
Okay.
But Stan and
you live here now.
Right.
I'm just visiting for a week.
Right. But I didn't grow up here.
Okay.
That's just the point. But Stan and I actually have known each other because we went to the same alma mater. And
I did not know that.
We both went to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee.
Mm-hmm.
But
do you like Nashville hot chicken?
I do, but it wasn't there when I was there. So I don't know. Was it there when you were there, Stan?
No. I only learned about it after I left Nashville.
Yeah.
Hot chicken.
Yeah. When they said Nashville hot chicken, I was like, that's not a thing. But I don't know exactly what year it was, but it was around 2000.
2002.
2002.
Yeah.
And I originally started attending Vandy in the early 90s and then dropped out. And then when I made a comeback to Vandy, I was much older. I think I started back when I was 28.
So you took a gap year or longer?
I took many gap years.
Oh, you were the pioneer.
Well, it wasn't pioneering. It was failing
forward.
It was not
failing backward every which way. And then I finally made it back to Vandy to finish my degree. But when I did make it back, Stan was attending at that point. So we kind of intersected for maybe only a year.
Didn't you graduate in the winter?
I finished in 2002. Yeah, December.
Yeah. So maybe 6 months because I was a freshman. I was a freshman in 2002.
Wow. Okay. Golly.
Were you instant friends or you just passed each other in the hallway?
We didn't really hang out just because of the age difference. But Stan was a rising
because you had multiple gap years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, right.
That would make you older.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm trying to do math in my head.
There. Yes.
Not as good.
No. For most of my 20s, I had missed out on college. So by the time that Stan was there, he was a rising star. He was just...
That's going to be edited out. Yeah.
It's true. He was very popular, very well known, and I was getting ready to leave. So we only got to know each other peripherally.
But I knew David as a role model. When I was a freshman at Vanderbilt, he was leading Bible studies and, basically preaching.
No.
At AACF. So he was in a leadership position. So that's how I knew him.
I was a lay leader with the ACF chapter there, the InterVarsity chapter for Asian Christian Fellowship.
Okay.
Because it wasn't there when I first attended Vandy. So when I saw it appear. When I was sort of part 2 at Vandy, I was like, this is what I would have really liked when I was incoming freshman. So that's how we met.
Amazing. Now, David and I, our
met.
paths intersected on the internet.
Right.
And actually before the internet, if I remember right, because we were buddies on AOL.
Depends on if Al Gore is involved, like what he would say. But But it wasn't. Yeah, I don't know exactly how we got to know each other.
On AOL, really? That's not a joke.
AOL, Export Joy 75.
Yeah, Export Joy.
Yeah.
And I was blogging on a Xanga at the time.
Yeah, Xanga.
Yeah, and then I don't know how you convinced me to blog about church stuff.
Well, that came later.
Did it? Okay.
But we were chatting on Buddy List and IM.
How did we even start talking? Do you remember?
Well, my story of jumping on the internet or the pre-internet with AOL and Prodigy and CompuServe.
Wow, these are all ancient terms.
Yes, they are.
This is amazing. Yeah,
yeah. I'm very
old.
Learning right now.
Or
I'm very old. I'm very old. I'm 58, so I grew up pre-internet and prehistoric almost. Right. Yeah. So I grew up with dial-up modems that were 300 baud.
Oh man!
You would hear the screech to connect, and you would be fighting for the phone line with busy signals.
Yeah, phone call would ruin your day.
And call waiting would cut off your connection, and your relatives are trying to use the phone. I was like, "Hey, what are you doing on the line?" I would stay up till 3 a.m. trying to get into bulletin board systems, which are the precursor to discussion board,
BBS,
precursor to social media, and it was part of my marriage also that my wife and I corresponded over email long distance.
This might be more context than is necessary, but
thank you. Thanks for the signal to move on.
This is awesome. This is awesome.
Yeah. Well, but some people like those origin stories, like a guy named Jin Lee that we know.
Well, this is like not just the origin of us. This is like origin of the internet. But anyway, I forgive.
Yes. It was instrumental in bringing us together on Xanga and on buddy lists. And I'm pretty sure I have some of those chats that we had about Asian American and Christianity and our mutual interest in how the two need to come together more instead of being like Asian American Christianity. We just happen to look Asian, but we do everything white people do. And so I was interested in exploring that topic because I don't know why, but I was interested. Well, partly because I'm Asian American and I thought that needed to be a thing instead of not a thing. Yeah. And I know for even today in 2024, it's not a thing for many Asian Americans, but we still think it should be a thing. And fast forward, since we have plenty to talk about. So fast forward from 2005 or so. And we've been chatting on Buddy List and on Xanga, commenting on each other's Xanga blog. And then I've been on WordPress blogs since 2000. We finally met in person.
Yeah. On
a road trip to New York State, I think it was, for a Bible conference. And we almost had a car accident. And so we've been friends for coming up on 20 years.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Wow.
Internet brought us together before internet dating.
It's beautiful.
Well, let's be clear, it wasn't dating. But yes, the internet did a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another significant thing was we got to talking and we started a team blog together, nextgenerationchurch.com.
Yeah.
And I just did the research 2 days ago, and that had a run of 12 or 13 years.
Yeah. You pointed that out. 2005 to 2017.
What was a good memory for you during that time? Because you were reluctant at first. I nudged you forward.
Yeah. I think it got really exciting with Linsanity, and there were a couple of really high sort of, I guess in that small sphere, right, a very esoteric conversation. Jeremy Lin, who was, professed Christian and having sort of lightning in a bottle success in the NBA, and just we had a great discussion online, and then I think it got really boosted by other people promoting it, but it went viral or somewhat bacterial. Like it wasn't like viral, but
yeah. Dr. Sonu, can you help us with that?
Septic.
Yeah, slightly. But that was a fun post. I remember we had a very controversial one called "Is Francis Chan a Sellout?"
Yeah,
that was a big one for us. Then we were on the Deadly Vipers controversy, and so we sort of hit some of the high notes during that stretch. So it was a fun time to blog.
And then it went out with a bang in 2013.
Oh, that's right. The an open letter to evangelical Christianity, which was led by some real sort of luminaries in our world, which is like Seung-Chan Ra and Eugene Cho and Kathy Kong. Like there were a few, many others who signed on, and it was really good. I think that was in response to not Deadly Vipers. That was in response to, was it Deadly Vipers?
No, it was two things that converged in the same week.
Okay.
One inciting incident was a skit, a little video about church planters playing off of the Karate Kid motif.
Okay.
I vaguely remember that.
And then the other one was the Red Guard Facebook post from Rick Warren.
Yes.
And the collision was the event for the Church Planter Conference and the Facebook post happened in the same week. And the conference was literally at Saddleback Church.
Wow.
It was not a coordinated effort on their part, but for some of us as Asian Americans, that was a painful moment, which provoked the open letter.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for reminding us. That was a while back.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to share about that race and faith incident in a class at Biola a couple months after that. So, and then I had an interesting position in the midst of that because I have friends on both sides of the aisle. I was trying to be bipartisan, but I couldn't broker a deal. I couldn't get a peace agreement going.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like, based on recent conversations, not too distant conversations that we've been a part of, that there's still some. You would think that in 2024 there would be greater understanding of
that's the 11 years later.
Yeah, there would be a deeper or a better sense of understanding of why that was painful for Asian Americans. But I think, from conversations that David and I have been in, I think there's still a gross misunderstanding. And a quick aside, but I think it's still a pain point, because I think, and I'm so glad that I'm honored to be in the presence of you two for this reason. I'm not, stop laughing. But I am, because you spoke out on something that I don't think we really were able to name clearly until years later, as in invisibility. You were naming what happens when a people are rendered invisible or are just invisible, and therefore there's no sort of consideration of how will this land for this community if we create a Facebook post or if we create a video that uses these tropes and makes light of them. And I think when I look back in the last decade or so in kind of key moments of the Asian American experience, especially in the church, as it relates to experiences in the church, I think there's some of these moments where you made, like, we were visible, or we made ourselves visible in ways that ruffled feathers, but also sparked conversation, moved some people. But yeah, it is, again, I won't go into the kind of conversations that we've had, but I think it's still pretty clear that there are folks who still don't understand why that was painful. Instead, they sort of center those who were put in the spotlight. And I think, to be charitable, we can be charitable and say that the Rick Warren didn't mean an offense. At the same time, an offense was made. So both of those things can be held at the same time. It doesn't demonize anybody. And I don't think that's what you both sought out to do.
Well, it's all the more painful and confusing on both sides of the aisle, because it was unintentional harm.
Yeah.
But unintentional harm is still harm.
Right.
But some people can't understand that category of harm.
Well, and I think proximity has a lot to do with it. So, DJ, you, like you said, you knew those people personally.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know them. And then I've also recognized the cultural proximity between West Coast Asians versus East Coast Asians. Like, I think on the West Coast, and again, I'm generalizing here, so I mean, it's not always true, but I think that if you've had the privilege as an Asian American growing up on the West Coast, there's probably a little bit more of a sense that you belong there, that you've been there for generations. But on the East Coast and in the South particularly, we don't really have that sort of I know it sounds like a very tiny privilege, but it is somewhat of a privilege to be like, hey, we've been here for a long time. We run things out here. You have to count for us. But I think you have that sort of pride in your chest, or that little bit of like swagger on the West Coast that on the East Coast and maybe in the South we don't really have. We are more invisible. We are sort of dismissible and not taken seriously. So when I noticed people on the East Coast or people like myself were saying like, "Hey, you can't. That's a foul. Like that's not okay." I remember West Coast Asians saying like, "It's okay. I know them. They didn't mean it that way." And it's interesting how proximity softened or allowed for that. Whereas from where I sit, I'm like, that just gives white people in my world who are friends with them thinking that it's okay. And I'm sorry, it's not.
Well, let me give you another angle on that, because while there is proximity, the voices that have come out loudly and vocalized actually start on the West Coast. So when you look at even the label Asian American, that came out of UC Berkeley in '65, which is West Coast, multi-generations of Asians. When you look at a most significant initiative called Stop AAPI Hate, that came out of San Francisco, raising visibility for anti-Asian.
They're not Christian, though. I think my point is these grievances in the evangelical world, the West Coast Asians were like, "Oh, it's okay. I know them. They didn't mean it that way." And it was like Soon-Chan Ra and Kathy Kong and others from the West Coast, like, no,
the East Coast.
Okay. East Coast.
Well, they were Midwest, but
Midwest and East Coast.
Right.
Just to acknowledge their geographical location. Because if we have any academic types, they love socio.
Sure, but Soon-Chan, he hails from Baltimore and
correct
Boston, so he's more East Coast than he is West Coast. And in the South, we were pissed because, like, hey, I mean, y'all are good friends with people at Catalyst and Andy Stanley and Charles Stanley and them, and they don't ever think about us. So if you're going to talk about us, not to go Will Smith on it, but get your name out, get my name out your mouth. That's how we felt in terms of like being angry about it, and then other Asians going like, "It's okay, I know them. They didn't mean it that way." It's like, I don't care who you are. I don't care who you're friends with. Don't talk about it.
Yeah. Wow.
Like all of us,
Okay. I've been put in my right place.
Well, but I agree with you. So politically, historically, the epicenter for Asian American resistance does come from the West Coast, but not Asian American Christians.
See, that's an interesting dichotomy, because the same West Coast where Asian Americans did rise up and bring social justice in the non-faith space has not happened in the Christian space.
Yeah, well.
That's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole nother conversation. Right? I was going to say,
lots of factors play into that.
So maybe we'll hand that off to Soon-Chan and Daniel Lee, since they're in the same place now at Fuller. And they've got a little podcasting. They can do the historical analysis on that. But yeah, thank you, Stan, for jumping in on that, because I was curious, because we're first person in that 2013 incident. And for you to notice that in 11 years later, not much has happened.
For people my age, Christians, Asian Americans, it was kind of a trailblazing moment, and it was very significant. I mean, my wife wrote her master's thesis on the Deadly Vipers event.
Really?
Yeah.
Can we invite her on the podcast
right now? Should I go upstairs?
Well, actually, I tried to invite her, and she said no, but I forgot to bring up that accomplishment.
Right. So it brought up, I think in a larger sense, it brought up this question of why haven't we questioned our identity? And do we matter? And I think it just brought up a lot of questions for us that we had never had a platform to ask, had never had a way to even think about those questions, and I think a lot of them, to be honest, still remain unanswered in a lot of ways. But it put Asian American identity, Asian American Christian identity on our radar, into our consciousness in a way that felt meaningful, in a way that wasn't there before. So again, I'm not joking when I say I'm honored to be here, because I know you both took a thrashing in some ways, and that thrashing sometimes has a long tail. And I'll say it if you don't want to say it, David, but I am disappointed that, we're in 2024 and there's still people who are digging in, who can't understand why that was painful. And their first response, and these are Asian Americans, their first inclination is to say, well, I know that person, I know that guy, I know that woman. They didn't mean that. And it's like they're not hearing the issue. Like I don't want to drop. I mean, we can cut this out, but I feel like there's endless parallels and endless examples out there in society where we can say this person did not mean harm, and yet harm happened. Are they in the right or are they in the wrong? Should they apologize or should they not? I think most people would say they should probably, yes. We know there's phrases about good intentions. The road to hell are paved with good intentions.
That's a trigger word, boy. Hell.
Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing that you're bringing up, Stan, is that we're already a subculture, right? And to be at the intersection of two they're not naturally and historically related. To be Asian American and Christian is already Asian and American is already an interesting Venn diagram. But then you throw in that third circle of Christian, evangelical Christianity, and it's like a subculture, right? So the fact that we're having this discussion within a pocket is already very esoteric. And in a pluralistic society, and when you have coastal differences with pretty large margins in generation and sort of cultural critical mass, I think it's become I know that disappointed or discouraged is this. I guess I'm not surprised after spending that much time blogging and sort of fielding comments and seeing what people responded to. I guess I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
I think Asian Americans, and this is a subject that you're really well familiar with at a clinical level, is that this cloak of invisibility has been a powerful defense mechanism for us, but now it's our curse. And I think when you wear that cloak of invisibility long enough, I would say one of the things I struggled with coming out of the blogosphere and really trying to exercise pastoral and ministerial sort of occupation is that it's hard to own my voice. It's hard to speak up. It's hard to take up any limelight or space without feeling like I'm just mucking up the grind. I'm just feel like I'm mucking things up. I'm complicating things that should be simple. So I and again, that might be like a traumatic response to trauma, particularly when it comes to neglect and invisibility.
Yeah. I mean, the last thing I'll say on it is, I think I can step back and let go of the right or wrong aspect of it. But what I find, what still feels like a raw nerve for me is, why couldn't they acknowledge pain? And why couldn't they be empathetic to pain? When a body of believers expresses their pain, why couldn't there be an audience for that first? And why couldn't there be a sensitivity and a willingness to understand and then come around that community? Why is the first reaction and the persistent response one of defensiveness and perpetrators assuming victimhood? Like, why is that? It just, this isn't the church, right? This is the entity, the institution in our society that should be most willing to acknowledge wrongdoing or harm when it happens, intent or not. So that part, it honestly still grieves me a bit, because I'm still a part of this, of the broader church and faith community. This is those people we're referring to, I claim as brothers and sisters in the same faith. And so it just feels like there's still a lack of reconciliation there.
I just think that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, there's a lack of reconciliation, for sure. The way I was going to wrap up my thought was, so the response to when they hear that pain is, oh, you're too sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And my response is, why are you so insensitive? Isn't it better to be sensitive to those who are, quote unquote, weak? Because that's what the exhortation of the Bible is to care for those who are weak or are sensitive, and build the unity and care for one another. Confounding.
I guess I think it's natural. I think that those who have power and have never, I mean, that's what privilege is to not have to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
So when sort of the mainstream Christian culture is suddenly corrected or reprimanded or, admonished to say like, hey, you didn't consider this esoteric group of Asian Americans, I think of course they're different. There's no way that we're seen as equals. So the power dynamic, I think, allows them to be, I've never heard of you before. I don't really care to hear from you again. And I just don't think that apology is the posture that white evangelicalism is used to. I mean, there's books written on white fragility, white rage, even. So I think now, at the time I was like, really like, oh, this is tragic. And now I'm like, oh, that's America. I don't think they give you anything.
Yeah.
Penny, for your thoughts.
Now, I'd like to make a move and say that what we've been talking around is not esoteric. It's actually embodied.
Yeah.
Even though many Asian Americans, and especially many Asian American Christians, refuse or are not aware of why identity and what issues that we have been blogging about for over 12 years, and having maybe armchair conversations off the record that we believe need to have more voice in conversations on the record in order to bring about healing and understanding. And that's why I found your presentation, Stan, so compelling and breakthrough when you connected the dots of how these issues are not seemingly esoteric, but actually embodied.
Mm-hmm.
Give us a summary of how you put that presentation together, and you've given it 3 or 4 times at least, both in faith and non-faith contexts. And that intersectionality and collision is remarkable.
Yeah. Thanks, DJ, for that. And by the way, you and I met, about a year ago?
Yes.
Is it more than a year ago now?
Just over a year ago, because of a guy named Jin Lee.
Yeah.
Catalyst Wellness Alliance. And actually, I was introduced to you and David again because of Angie K. Hong.
That's right.
From Durham, because the two of you and 2 other people were trying to start a podcast about Korean American masculinity, but I'm not sure what happened to that.
Life happened. Well, yeah, I think almost from the get-go, you and I have been talking about this since we've met. And this area, this topic that you're referring to is the connections between childhood adversity, childhood trauma, not just in childhood, I could say, but in the adolescent period and even into adulthood. But how those experiences can connect to all sorts of different outcomes that are negative in childhood, in adolescence and especially in adulthood. And there's been I can go into the research on that, but just to respond to your comment, there's just been so much research done connecting these experiences with our health that it's at this point just indisputable. It's been studied in almost every developed country across the world. Several different races, ethnicities, in urban and rural settings, in all sorts of income strata. It's been studied in basically every group you could think about at this point, and the same relationship has been observed. And so most of the research in the United States has focused on mainstream populations that are well represented and often at the forefront of our societal conversations. So certainly white communities, Black communities, Latinx, but there hasn't been a whole lot of information, whole lot of research done with the Asian American community. And, when I first learned about this topic in 2015, 2016, I was almost done with my residency training. So I was 3 months away from graduating, where I could essentially practice freely in any community within the bounds of my specialty. And being that close to finishing my training and learning about this topic, I was astonished. I was angry that I didn't learn about this as a core part of my training. I had it. It felt serendipitous that I learned about it at the time. But it was one of those things where when I heard about it, I knew, oh, this is really, really important. And it kind of kickstarted this journey for me of wanting to learn as much as I could about it. And yeah, as the more I learned about it, I realized how much little there was with respect to the Asian American experience, and especially Asian American Christians. And then in the pandemic, when some of the anti-Asian violence started making headlines, I came across an article in the Times where they quoted Stephen Yun, the actor, and he had that line about invisibility. Sometimes, I'm paraphrasing here, but sometimes I feel like the Asian American experience is when you're thinking about everyone else, but no one is thinking about you. And when I read that line, I feel like my body started trembling, because he named so poignantly the thing that I've been feeling, where I, as an Asian American, as a Korean American growing up, I have when I am a minority, when I am the sole Asian or one of the few Asians in a social setting, I automatically defer or accommodate or squash my preferences, dismiss. I play down my culture. I play down my Koreanness, and not because somebody told me that, not because somebody took me aside and said, this is how you survive, but because instinctively, that's how I survived. I got so used to that invisibility feeling. And so after I read that line, I started thinking about, how has this affected me? And how can I map this experience of invisibility to what I've learned about trauma? And trauma is a very broad term. The way I would define trauma is it's any experience, let's say that is encountered in childhood, that overwhelms that person's ability to cope in a healthy way. So trauma can, the same natural disaster event can be experienced by 3 different people, but they can each experience it in a different way. And that experience can have different effects. So the example I use is like a tornado. So if DJ, you grew up in Oklahoma.
Well, you could use the example of a hurricane. That'd be more timely.
Well, yeah, the hurricane we just went through. Yeah. So if you grew up in the Florida Keys, seeing hurricanes every year, multiple hurricanes every year, and David and I live up here in the north part of Georgia, where we don't really see hurricanes, and you see all of this devastation happen. For you, DJ, that event might not be experienced in a way that reaches the definition of trauma, but for me and David, it very well could. Mm-hmm. So, trauma is less about necessarily the event, but more how those things are experienced. So that can explain some within group variability. But there are many different experiences that can meet that threshold or definition of trauma. Mm-hmm. A lot of times we think about abuse and its variations, right? Physical abuse, emotional, sexual. We can think about, the chaos of living in a home with a parent who has an untreated mental health problem or substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. Maybe you, as a child, saw violence against one of your parents. What we don't tend to name as often is the experience of neglect. Mm. And neglect can take a number of forms, but the most common ones are physical neglect and emotional neglect. Wow. And physical neglect, it's that one's more obviated when you just go to someone's home and you see their refrigerator's empty, there's no clothing, the water's cut off, the lights are off, right? But emotional neglect is a very insidious kind of neglect in that it's very, very difficult for the individual who experienced it to remember it. Mm. Because part of the way we naturally cope and survive experiences of emotional neglect is in a way avoiding or denying that we experienced it. And children just do this naturally. We do it very naturally. And what I realized, just to wrap this part up, is we Asian Americans have, because the experience of invisibility, it feels like a theme, because it's such a shared experience, has almost felt normal in a sense. It's just life in America. Mm-hmm. But when you sort of zoom in on that experience of invisibility, and you start to allow yourself to consider how that has affected you individually, how that has affected your perception of yourself, how that has affected the way that you show up in society, I think for many of us, we realize that it wasn't a benign experience at all, and rather it's an iteration of neglect that's systemic, that's prevalent on a societal level.
And the data shows it's not benign.
Oh, absolutely. So
mention two of the things that it actually impacts that we're not aware of.
Yeah, I mean, there's many studies on the impact of neglect in childhood, but one study that I cited in that presentation was they found that for children who experience different kinds of traumas, abuse and neglect, or other types of maltreatment, those children who experienced neglect had the lowest scores around creativity and confidence.
Wow.
And Jacob Hamm, who's one of my trauma role models, I don't even know if that's a thing, but he's a psychologist at Sinai in New York. Mm-hmm. And a very, just has a profound kind of presence about him. I learned this from him. He said that the person who experiences emotional neglect as a child, when they're an adult, doesn't by default look back on their childhood and say, I experienced neglect. What it more often comes out as is, yeah, I didn't have the best childhood. It could have been better, but my parents did the best they could. Mm-hmm. And so what he's sort of naming there is the almost universal coping mechanism to neglect, where the person dismisses or is inclined to dismiss the impact of neglect on their lives. Maybe there's not even an awareness of it, mm-hmm. but there's almost kind of this knee-jerk move towards explaining away why they didn't get what they needed. My parents were busy, they were working all the time, etc. And I think, I've said this before in conversations and in different presentations, but I think one of the reasons we have a hard time really, digging deep and thinking about experiences of neglect in our own lives is because as soon as we open that door, we feel this rubber band pulling us back to say, don't be disloyal to your parents. Don't disrespect them. Do you know how hard they worked? Do you know how much they sacrificed? And so we can't actually even open the door without shame coming right in.
There it is. See, erasing shame.
We got to erase shame.
Thank you. That's why we're having this conversation.
Right. So we can't even open the door without shame flooding in, and it makes us close it. So we can't even interrogate our own childhoods to a great extent because that shame rubber band pulls us right back out. And so what we have to name, or what I've been trying to name, is, we can hold two or more things. We can hold a dialectic here where let's start by honoring our parents, and let's start by recognizing and acknowledging and being deeply grateful for their sacrifice and their unspoken dedication to the family, their incredible work ethic. Let's start from there. We can hold that at the same time as we open this door and interrogate our own lived experiences as children. And one of the examples that I feel like is sadly not uncommon is a person could have had a father who worked endless hours overtime at whatever job they had, running a small business or doing whatever it is they did, and they worked diligently. They never missed a day. They never complained about it. They always were able to provide for their family, and so we can recognize that, but we can also recognize that same man who did that, who worked incredibly hard and made those sacrifices, was the person who, when he came home drunk. And when he was drunk, he became terrifying to his family. He might have even, yelled or put hands on his wife or children. And that is not okay. And so we have to be able to name those things to be able to make sense of them. And I think for many Asian Americans, we haven't been able to hold that dialectic. We haven't sort of been empowered or given permission to hold that dialectic because we don't talk about this. We don't talk about these experiences on a regular basis. Shame, if anything, keeps us from really vocalizing any of them. We keep it buried. We suppress it. We deny it. We can't even open that door again because we want to honor our parents and we don't want them seen in a negative light. And what I'm saying here is we don't have to see them and that we don't have to paint them or hold them in a negative light. We can hold this tension of, again, acknowledging and honoring all that they've done, but at the same time, recognizing that as children, we didn't always get the things that we needed, that every child, I would argue, deserves. And, ever since having kids, I feel even more strongly about this, that kids do deserve and need nurturing care. They need presence. They need attunement. And these are the things that are so good for healthy development, healthy brain development. And en masse, Asian Americans and Asian American Christians, a lot of us didn't have, we can't say we had this experience growing up.
Okay. Is there a word for dialectic in Korean?
I don't know.
Probably not. So I think the idea of holding two things in tension, it just sounds so un-Asian. Asians like things black and white in singularity. And I'm speaking as a Chinese for those who are just listening to the audio.
But I would say there is a, I mean, we don't know if there's a word or not, right? But there is a concept of balance. There's a concept of moderation.
Okay.
You know, in Chinese culture, the yin and yang, right? There's a concept of both and.
Right.
So I do think it exists.
Yeah.
And I would say that, you know,
well played.
Yeah, touche. One of the markers of someone who is living in a chronically stressed state is when it and we can call it like survival brain, when they're living in that survival brain state as opposed to their regulated, whole, or integrated cognitive state, so to speak. One of the signs of it is black and white thinking. When you're in that survival mode, when you're stressed, you want to see the world in black or white. You want to make, you want decisions to be made quickly. It's very difficult when you're living in that survival mode to hold the tension of two things can be true at the same time. You actually need to be in this more integrated, regulated state of mind to be able to do that. So, I know you hear this phrase like, "Oh, I'm a simple person. I like to see the world simply." Like, I think there's one way you can look at the world where, yes, it is simple, but a lot of things, especially when it comes to lived experiences and intersectionality, require a dialectic mode of thinking. We have to be able to hold multiple truths at the same time.
David, you have 2 minutes for a response.
Well,
we're in election season, so that's
I think the hard or the difficult part for me in terms of opening the door, Stan, is not only does it shame but it potentially brings shame on our parents, but I think it brings deeper existential questions of value and worth on myself. I wasn't worth. Maybe I was worth having a house for, but I don't know if I was worth spending time with and being invested in. I think that's the deep existential question of, am I worth that? And then I think we had to work to find our worth. And I think that's part of where, so that's, I think, one of our generation's sort of challenges is to find our worth outside of our work. Secondly, I think when I see my parents now, I realize that they were also children of trauma. Like, my parents were born in the 40s, which means they were 10 years old, tops 8 years old when the Korean War broke out. And even prior to the Korean War, it was Japanese occupied. So they were also, there's a couple of lost generations there. So I don't know, I know that Japan had a pretty big influence for probably a lot of our parents' generation, whether it was in the U.S. gets mixed into this global geopolitics, gets mixed into this because the bombings in Taiwan, the rape of Nanking, is there Nanjing? I forget
depends how you pronounce it.
Okay, so it's both. But I think there's a lot of, I think one thing that we can all say, and the reason why this is so white, like you said, en masse, is because we're all at least grandchildren of war. And I don't know how many generations it takes to sort of work this out. I mean, I know I hate to say this term because we're in unprecedented times, but I want to say, like, I'm not sure when we've been in precedented times. So the idea of us sort of, I guess, the rising tide of both economic class and stability, now healing is a luxury good we can afford.
Oh, yeah. Let me respond to some of those thoughts. What you said at first about opening the door, what comes along with that is these thoughts of worthiness or lack thereof. And what you're naming actually is what children are most terrified of instinctively. That's why you see children who are living in the most chaotic circumstances at home, right? Maybe there's a mother who has a drinking problem, and a dad who's depressed, or vice versa. And that child is experiencing profound neglect. You'll never hear that child say, "My parents are mistreating me. They're not doing their job with me." What you'll hear is, "If only I was better at blank. If only I cleaned my room. If only I followed directions better. I got better grades. Then my dad would feel better. Then my mom would stop drinking." So they kind of make sense of it real time, because the most terrifying thing for any human being is to come to terms or face that reality that they are unworthy. And this is why I feel like the church has to step in to this trauma conversation, because we have, I don't know how to say it, but we have the gospel that says that you have inherent value for who you are. Like we have the antidote to that dilemma of worthiness, right? And I don't know if there are other pockets of society that have a narrative as clear as Christianity on that point, that you don't have to do anything, son or daughter, you just matter because you are mine. And I wish that we had more of that kind of culture coming out from the church, but instead it does feel like, tragically, we live in this performance-based, externally validated mode of worthiness, where you have to accomplish, you have to succeed, you have to say the right things, believe the right things, you have to act the right way to be accepted into the community, but also to have a sense of self-acceptance. So, you're hitting on something really deep and profound there. And I think, for me, if it wasn't for Christianity, I don't know if I would be able to open that door. If it wasn't for the gospel and who God says I am, I don't know if I would be able to open that door and truly interrogate what my experiences growing up, both in the home, in the community I lived in, and how society viewed me. But it's because of the gospel that I feel like I have, a holy kind of armor to go in and I'll be okay, But that's a question of faith, of course. The last thing that you said, though, this idea of luxury, I want to just gently and kindly push back on that.
Gentle. Come on, be yourself.
No, because I've made this point to DJ before, but because I've heard from multiple people that we live in this kind of this period of luxury where we get to heal, we get to ask the question of what life, what did I go through, and I think I don't think this is what you're intending, but one of the sort of unintended consequences of that thought is this is frou-frou in some way. This is superfluous. This isn't necessary. And I think my two thoughts around that is, one, what is harder truly? What is harder in the sense of not changing anything, living life as it is, not being aware of any of this, just doing things reactively, or B, once we know that this is going on, trying to change course. And changing course means doing the work, asking the questions, opening the metaphorical doors, and in a sense, stepping into the painful experiences that we are terrified of thinking about. What is harder? I would argue it's B. B is way harder. But at the same time, I agree with you. Yes, we are not living in societal chaos where we are forced to live in this sort of survival mode day in and day out. In that sense, yes, we have the opportunity and in some ways the privilege, but I wouldn't call it a luxury. I would call it a responsibility. And it's a big, challenging, lifelong, daunting responsibility that you can't do alone. We need a movement of people to be heading in this direction. And I don't think it can be this sort of one-off thing. I think it has to be church communities, church culture that's shifting towards healing, not calling it a luxury, but we have a responsibility. And my second point is the responsibility is not, it's one to our wounded selves, the younger version of ourselves, the children that are living within us, but it's also to that next generation, to our children, our literal children, to which we have this responsibility to heal. At some point, there has to be some generation in our society, but just in the line of humans, where we say enough. Like, I'm not going to mindlessly pass on that which I experienced as a child, that which my parents experienced as children, that which my grandparents experienced as children. We have to say enough. Because the thing about intergenerational trauma, if it's left unaddressed, if it's left unseen, if it's left buried, it's like a snowball that's going downhill. It's going to pick up speed. It's going to accelerate. It's going to get bigger in mass, and it's going to cause more problems. It's going to propagate. It's going to proliferate. And I think I would argue, this is not to turn the conversation in a different direction, but I think we're seeing the evidence of that in our society today, in our fragmentation, in the broken communities, in our loneliness, in our pursuit of comfort, of these efforts to self-soothe, in place of connection and community. We're seeing the fruits of intergenerational trauma picking up speed.
Forgive me for insinuating that it's a luxury. I didn't mean it that way in that sense. I think I meant it, and I really think what you're proposing is absolutely beautiful and necessary. However, I feel like the challenge is, how do you go from a generation that was trying to survive, that neglected us to survive, and now we're neglecting our kids just out of sheer distraction and hedonism, for lack of a better word?
Ooh.
Because we're trying to, again, one of the things I've noticed is that the tail of neglect is super long. And you're right, you actually have to be awakened and shaken out of it to be like, unless you own this is a curse upon generation.
Yeah.
So I totally feel you, but I find that even, and I'll throw myself under the bus first, the courage and attention that it requires to heal is often a cost that's more than I can afford.
Yeah. I don't think this is not short order work.
No.
This is not a season that we go through. I recently read a book called What It Takes to Heal. And it's from an author who was a mental health provider in the Black Lives Matter movement. And she was responsible for like the mental well-being of that organization. And she saw it crumble from within.
Right.
And she said something I thought was so profound, that like, healing, we all want it. It's not a destination. You don't arrive at it. It's an orientation. It's a movement too. It's a process. And I think that's what it is. It's not this sort of end state that we can exist in, or we want to exist in, where now I'm the father I want to be. Now I'm the parent I want to be. Now I'm the spouse I want to be. But it's this willingness to be on that journey. And it's lifelong. I mean, again, we have to unlearn so much of our survival strategies and these reactive patterns that helped us survive as children, as teenagers, even as adults. None of that is easy, and it for sure cannot be done in isolation alone. So yeah, it is daunting. I'm with you, man. It's nothing that we can. It's not something to dismiss. Not to downplay. And I don't even have an easy answer for that. How do we do that? I think there are some intentional steps we can take, but I think we have to. Our tendency too is we might have this like better version of ourselves in our mind that we want to move towards, and I don't even think we should necessarily even think about what that better version is. I think it's it's a step-by-step, very granular, very slow process of unlearning and relearning, and coming to terms with who we are and our identities and embracing who God says we are holistically, not just left brain, but right brain, and in our bodies, who God says we are. I think so many of us can love God conceptually. We love the idea of God, but God remains abstract. And you hear sermons all the time where the gospel is talked about in this abstract sense. I feel like that is actually endemic in Asian American churches, where we talk about theological concepts. We talk about God in this truth sense. But I think what we need a little bit more of is God in the Jesus sense of a relationship. And that is really hard to do. You can't just tomorrow do that. I think it's a slow process of unlearning and relearning.
Well, I'm sorry I don't mean to hog up the mic, but I want to push back by I'm not countering anything you have to say. I think everything you're saying is right on. I think that the reason why this sort of erosion of self is very difficult, and we're on an upward incline on that, is because the democratization and the empowerment of the individual has made it so that before I could be oppressed by or marginalized by some external force. The thing that's happening that I think is interestingly, and maybe it's not historically unique, but I think at an individual societal level, it's unique because now I can marginalize myself. Like I can pimp like I used to be like, oh, you have to work for the man. I'm working for the corporation. The boss is really these Q4 numbers. I got to get them up. Now, if I work, I can do this because I'm Ubering. I'm YouTubing myself. I'm pushing myself out there. I have commoditized myself in the pursuit of something else. So to that degree, which before somebody enslaved me to erase myself, now I pimp myself out, and who do I have to blame? I am my own slave master. I am the source of my own injustice. And I think that is a novelty historically that through technology we haven't had before. And so the even, and you know this too, is like the industry that is so quickly propped up, even in Christian discipleship, even in Christian spiritual formation, in Christian therapy. These have become industries that now we're like, how do I keep up with this? The thing that was supposed to be for peace and all these retreat centers is supposed to be for peace. I've got spiritual formation directors, blah, 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 this and that. We have no peace. I am like, my appetite for this has made me a glutton to the point that I cannot fast. And there, to your point, the hard work is to let it all go. And really be honest with who I am with God. And that is a terrifying space that there is no proxy.
There is none.
There is no proxy. There is no substitute.
And there's no model.
Work. Right. There is no model for you, as there's no model for me other than to be like, oh, I see Stan doing it. That gives me the courage to do it. But that's where I think this gets really hard.
Technology has exacerbated this. But I would also say, though, that when you read like Thomas Merton, he talks about the false self, the false identity, true identity. And he wrote, I think, in the mid 20th century. That was kind of his prime. So even then, with the industrialization that he was seeing across society, he could see how much we're so willing to put the false self out there, and neglect this true self. This is why I said in that presentation, going back to it, DJ, that verse, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That as yourself part wrecks me, because for most of my life, I've just sort of bypassed it. Oh yeah, of course I love myself. But lately, what I'm really kind of to your point, David, is like, do I actually love myself in with faith, in the way that God sees me?
Right.
No, I don't. I love myself to the extent I can put this false self easily out there that makes me feel good in society. But loving myself if I had none of that, I think that it's not a matter of selfishness, it's a matter of faith. And I don't know that in the church we have a healthy way of talking about that. I don't know. I really struggle with that. I think we're very reluctant to even consider the question because we have a knee-jerk response against selfishness. We don't want to be self-absorbed. We don't want to talk about things that validate self-absorption or selfishness or selfish behavior. And I can go into some thoughts about that, like the difference between a healthy kind of self-love and selfishness. I think those are actually on opposite extremes. But we have to, I think those are some of the things that we need to be talking about more because, Thomas Merton says, you can't actually love your neighbor until you love yourself. You can't actually love yourself until you love your neighbor. Like that's a dialectic. It's a paradox that can only be made sense of in a supernatural sense. The world will tell you to choose one or the other. Love others, but completely neglect yourself. Or be so self-absorbed that you don't care about anybody else. The gospel says like you hold those two things in tandem. And the only way to make sense of that is to know that who we are and who others are in God.
And let's dig down and drill a bit deeper into this as we've explored and drawn the context of your learnings from the neurobiology and medical and our bodily response to trauma and family systems, neurobiology, and so on into the church, which we've just started revolving around. And aside, in the show notes, we'll add a link at erasingshame.com to the full presentation because that is worth listening to, that you're getting an intro to in our conversation here. Will you add a link in your show note?
Sure.
All right. Dave has gone on the record and said he will also add a link to the show notes. So that's worth listening for the entirety. But we want to touch on that, introduce you enough so as we join this conversation, you can get a sense of why this is such an important conversation. And it's such a new conversation because while Thomas Merton laid some good framework and context in the 20th century, we need to learn how to talk about it in the 21st century, especially among Asian Americans. So continuing this conversation, we have the gifted and talented Hannah On, worship leader at 4 Points Church, which happens to also be the church where Stan Sonu attends. And he made a version of this presentation that we just alluded to that's in the show notes of our respective podcasts about average childhood experiences, trauma, and Asian American identity, and our Christian identity. And he had this incredible aha moment as he surveyed the audience of Asian American Christians in suburban, upperly mobile greater Atlanta, that this neurobiological response of neglect even showed up in these very accomplished people that were not having maladaptive behaviors per se. Well, I'll just let you describe that and have Hannah and David join that conversation, because that's where I think this conversation needs to start and continue.
Yeah.
Beyond this podcast.
I know Hannah would have a lot to say about it, and David. Yeah, so a few months ago, or several months ago, I had the opportunity to share on mental health and the adverse childhood experiences study with our church, and about 60 people out of our community of, I think, 300 or 400 came out. So it's a pretty sizable group. I was actually expecting only like 20. So 60 people came out, and just a bit more background about the adverse childhood experiences study. So the study that we were talking about before, the different types of trauma, a lot of those categories came from or became more popularized through the adverse childhood experiences, or ACE study. And what these researchers did was they asked 17,000 adults about 10 different categories of interpersonal adversities that could be experienced before the age of 18 only in the home. So they asked about different kinds of abuse, different kinds of neglect, different kinds of stress that a child could experience in the home growing up. Mom or dad with a mental health problem or a substance use disorder, an incarcerated relative, intimate partner violence against the mother, etc. And what they found in the initial study was, in the initial study, I would say, importantly, of these 17,000 adults, most 75% were white. I think the next, or 75% were white. I believe 11% were Asian or Latinx. 6 to 8% were Black. 75% had gone to college. 100% were insured. So this was a very middle class / affluent participant group. And in this sample of people, about 2 out of every 3rd person had 1 ACE or more, and 12.5%, or 1 in 8 people, had 4 ACEs or more. So they were shocked when they did the study. They didn't realize how common adversities were in childhood because we don't talk about them. So, fast forward to early 2024, I'm giving this presentation, and I invited those participating to do an anonymous ACE questionnaire, give the same questions that were asked to the original sample. And I didn't know, honestly, what to expect. You're right, DJ. Our church community is predominantly Asian American, and I think it's okay to say this. We're mostly middle class / affluent. People live all over Atlanta, but I would say that it's a fairly affluent community, and it's a community in which people seem like they're doing well. Like they have their lives together. They live in good neighborhoods, have homes, have stable jobs. Kids seem to be doing well. And so we did the ACE questionnaire, and I don't remember the exact numbers. I think it's in that presentation, but I do remember one number or one statistic that was surprising. And it was that instead of 1 in 8 or 12.5% having 4 or more, as it was in the original ACE study, it was like 30 to 35% of the people who were there had 4 ACEs or more.
Wow.
Yeah. And I didn't show the distribution of ACEs in the presentation, but when I looked back through the data, emotional neglect was a really common experience. So I would modify what you said. Ostensibly, it doesn't seem like, if you visit our church, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of dysfunction or a lot of maladaptive behavior going on. But it's very clear at the same time that people might be hurting. And what we're really good at is not necessarily working through that hurt or pain. We're actually really good at denying it, moving on, suppressing it, burying it, distracting ourselves from it, being preoccupied with other things. And the evidence of the dysfunction perhaps might be more subtle, but it's in our relationships. It's in our marriages. It's in the relationships we have with our children. And it's not to blame anybody. That's the very opposite of what I'm trying to say here. It's just to say childhood trauma, childhood adversity that goes unaddressed, that isn't witnessed, that isn't recognized. We know from, again, an abundance of research, it causes all kinds of problems. And most predominantly, it causes relational problems. I think what we've done as a church is begin this process of talking about it. But I think in large part, and this is not to criticize our church in any way, but we've so normalized living with the ACEs and not dealing with them. That is actually more common than the counter narrative of unpacking that. And I know Hannah can speak to those experiences or that process. We've so normalized just living with ACEs that we accept relationships and friendships that are superficial, that are perpetually dissatisfying. We accept as normal disconnection from our children. We don't know how to regulate, and I'll speak for the men here. We don't have a capacity to understand our emotionality. We understand rage and glee from sports. I don't know, but our emotional menu is greatly limited. And instead of wondering, like, why don't I experience the full range of human emotions, we say, well, all men are like this, or Asian men are like this. We've created these stories that allowed us to keep things buried. And I think that's not unique to our church, but it's probably common in many of the Asian American churches, not just Asian American churches, but churches across the U.S.
Now, Hannah and Stan, how long have you been part of 4 Points? And Hannah, what was your response when you first heard that?
I think we've both been there like we've both been at 4 Points, 2 years?
Yeah, we started early 2023.
Same time. Yeah.
Oh, recent.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we go way back. Yeah,
we do go way back.
How far back?
Farther back than David and I go.
No way. Really?
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Like a youth group.
Yeah, this far back.
Yeah. Hannah was one of my worship mentors growing up.
Yeah, this is a long time ago.
Taught me the ropes.
Way over 20 years, 25 years ago. Yeah. I sadly was not a part of that conversation that day. I don't know where I was, but I've heard you speak on that and share your heart on that. And sadly, I'm part of that percentage of Asians that have experienced 4 or more ACEs. That's my story. And I don't know if you want me to go into that or not, but I think like I can go deeper into my story, but as you share what you're sharing now, I think I always look towards hope and the hope of being restoried, the hope of redemption, the hope of changing the narrative, the hope of changing the trajectory of healing that God is doing within us, within our children, from generation to generation. And I feel like God's been doing that work within my heart over the last, 10 plus years. And a lot of that just started with the awareness of, I need help.
Mm-hmm.
I'm broken. Like I grew up in a very messed up family. And I think for many years, I kind of ignored it. I hid it. I didn't realize it. And I just thought this was my lot in life of growing up in a very abusive home, physically, verbally, spiritually abusive. Even my earliest memory as a 4-year-old is just the kitchen table being flipped and food being thrown everywhere, to being forced to memorize scripture in Korean or the Apostles' Creed in Korean when I'm 4 and I speak English, and if I wasn't able to memorize it, I was beaten. And this is a 4 or 5-year-old child. And so for the longest time, I just thought, okay, this is the way that life is for an immigrant family. And my parents immigrated from Korea in the 70s. And I just thought, okay, this is all I know. And this is just the way that it's going to be. And so by the time I hit college, I was like, I just want to get out of here. Although I went to school like 2 miles from my house. But I was like, I'm going to get out of here and not come home. And I never came home, even though it was 2 miles from my house. And it wasn't until I got married right out of college, and I had 3 babies. And it was when I had my 3rd baby, I had a moment where I guess it was definitely a traumatic moment. And I'm just going to be careful just to be honoring to my parents who are still alive. But it was a traumatic moment that made me realize that, yes, I need help. And I have a very distorted view of God. And that's impacted because of my view of my own father. And so that just sent me on this trajectory of getting help, the help that I needed. And I didn't realize that me getting the help that I needed was the healing journey that God had me on, the path that he has had me on for today. And so it all started off with starting worship school. I went to a worship school called Worship Circle, and I went on a retreat. It was like right off the bat, I went on a retreat, and I just remember being an emotional mess and feeling like, because I hadn't left my kids in ever, and this is my first time away from them. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was Good Father had just come out that year. And every time I heard that song, I was a wreck. And I could not lead that song corporately because I could not believe that song in my heart. So I couldn't lead it from my heart. And so I remember walking into that space and hearing about and learning about hearing from God. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about that, about hearing or listening prayer. And it's just spending some time in silence and just asking God questions and spending time to hear what God has to say to you. And so they gave us some questions to ask God. And I remember just sitting there, and the last question was, Father, show me how much you love me. Tell me how I'm your beloved daughter. And I just sat there. I sat there for a whole hour, and I got to that last question. And when that last question hit, I just remember the Lord just speaking over my heart. And it's not like a audible voice, but it's just like a knowing in your heart of God saying, I'm a good father and I love you. And it was just those very simple words that rocked my world and just sent me on this amazing journey of healing. And I just finished this book called Renovated by Jim Wilder. And that has rocked my world lately as well, in the sense that he talks about how God, through his Hesed love, through salvation, he's after our hearts. And he, through his Hesed love, he attaches to us through his attachment love. And that's something that I've been processing and realizing, like, as a child, I was never attached to my parents. They never gave me they gave me love, but any attachment I received from them was very detached and not what I needed to function as a normal adult. And I can say in that moment after I read that book, and I wish I could say more eloquently about this book, but obviously I can't. That's okay. But I can say that moment marks when God just put his hand upon me and just said, I love you. And he was attaching himself to my heart. And that forever changed the trajectory of my life. And just from that, I was just like on this mission of healing. I went through counseling, and I did EMDR counseling through a lot of the trauma that I experienced. And along the pathway, he also brought me to spiritual direction. And in spiritual direction, God God has, that's kind of where I've landed in this pocket now of my season of life, is just experiencing friendship with God and noticing the movement of God in my life as he continues to heal me on my healing journey. Mm-hmm. So that's just a short nutshell of what God's been doing. But just the realization to the transformation. And he's still doing the work and still moving. And but there's the awareness piece that's going on within myself of, man, I'm broken. I need help. What can I do to change? What's going on within me? Where is that brokenness coming from? Where is it stemming from? Is it from my childhood trauma? Most likely, yes. What specifically? Is it a memory? Could be that. Just been going after all those things.
Yeah. That's powerful because, I've known you for a long time, like we said, and I know you've been a Christian for a long time and a devoted one. You were not half-hearted with it, even at an early age. And I think it makes it that much more powerful that you've had these experiences lately, these revelations, these awakenings. And I think it just goes to show how much we can, and I'm not saying this is what you did, but certainly in my case, I can play church. I can play the faith game so well. It's almost, I can't see the distinction between, is this real faith or is this my external need for am I seeking validation externally, right? I couldn't, but I think the more aware we are of our stories and how they've impacted us, the more we can start to make that distinction more clearly and hear actually what God is saying in our lives and then believe it and embrace it, accept it, all those things.
Can I jump in and ask if this, the presentation of this and your story, Hannah, which is really compelling, do you feel like the receptivity of, just your community of 4 Points, that you feel like they get it and they're leaning in? Or is it like, well, people who get it, and the people that are moving on?
I think there are pockets of people.
Yeah. I feel like there's some initial enthusiasm, and it's honest, it's true. But over time, there's a regression to the mean. To be balanced about it, I don't think one presentation is going to shift culture. One presentation is not going to move someone. All we did there was raise the issue, bring it to people's attention, put it on their radar. So I didn't have an expectation that would be the catalyst for a movement. At the same time, I think, and I don't know if this has been your experience, Hannah, but for me, the biggest barrier for any kind of movement or unlearning or willingness to jump in on this process of healing is fear. And in some ways, the affluent, the successful are in a more precarious position because we have, through our privilege and through the financial security and social security, not the benefit, but the sort of all the payoffs that come with external success, we've kind of cocooned ourselves against the reality of the situation we're in, and it makes it really hard to discern what's broken in my life. In some ways, we can live an existence where we don't have to come to terms with that brokenness. The marriage is not working. The marriage is dysfunctional. But I can instead of dealing with it, preoccupy myself with golf or other leisurely activities, make sure that we have a scheduled date night. and then we can look back over 5 years and be like, well, we made it that long. Obviously, we're doing something well. I don't want to be too on the nose here, but I think in some ways, this is a really, really steep uphill climb that we're trying to pursue here. I do feel like the path forward, though, is exactly what Hannah mentioned. It's this restorying with others in community. I don't think anybody can be on this journey alone. In fact, I don't think that from one, like physiologically, we are social creatures. We do better in healthy community. We need that. But two, I don't think God would have us do this in isolation. I think the point of community is to represent and mirror like what it means to be a healing presence to each other. So I wish I saw more of that. I wish we had more of that. Maybe you're seeing that, Hannah, in among the women, but I have yet, and I'll say this on the record, like I have yet to see that among the men in our church.
I've actually had the opportunity to walk with 5 other women in our church this past year, and we have been part of a story group where we've gone through Dan Allender's workbook called To Be Told, and once every couple of weeks we come together and we write our story. We write a part of our story, and we share our story, and we hold our stories, and we cry together. And it's been a beautiful healing journey to walk together in community and to heal together and to bond together. And so I feel like I've seen it. I've been part of that. And I don't know. Maybe you'll be the catalyst, Stan, to start a story group. But I see glimpses. Yeah. Like it's starting. And there's a women's retreat coming up, and I know
more is in store.
Yeah, more is in store in that. Yeah. Like God is using our story group to pour into that. And I feel a lot of excitement for that. And I just keep thinking of the phrase, hurt people, healed people, heal people. And the more that we can be talking about this, the more awareness that we can bring, the more that we can share our stories, the more that it brings healing to the community.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, I might come across cynical about it, but I am truthfully hopeful. The thing about our church is this community, our pastoral leadership is really open to this conversation in ways that I've never seen before. And it's not this navel-gazing kind of openness where, okay, we're going to be completely insular, but there's a sense of desiring the both and. Like we want to be outwardly focused and intentional, but not to the extent where we're neglecting our own internal well-being. And I mean, we're not perfect at it. And I would say like the goal isn't to be perfect at it and to never to have no, to avoid any missteps around it. But I think for that reason, as a community, we know more than we did a year ago. Mm-hmm. And we certainly know more than we did 6 months ago. And we have certain ministries, the story group that Hannah's talking about, emotionally healthy spirituality, where we have sort of organized ways to talk about some of these things. So there is positive movement, but I guess I at times feel the weight of it all. Mm-hmm. And the part that always gives me urgency is like, I'm a pediatrician, and so I want to see children thrive. I want to see children do well. I don't want to see children grow up in homes where they feel like they have to perform to get attention or affection. Like that was us. Like we have lived through that, where love was conditional or attention was conditional. Being in relationship with our parents felt conditional at times. And this is so for me, I guess the urgency comes when I sort of see the intergenerational implications of it. And that, again, that's not to throw anybody specifically at our church under the bus, but I just know I've seen it in my clinic, I've seen it in the research, I've seen it in my friendships, I've seen it in my own life. Unaddressed trauma creates not only health problems, but relational fragmentation, context of emotional dysregulation that create harm. So I have hope. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think this is what God wants, and He needs us to wake up and move it along with Him, or at least participate in this in an active way. So I definitely have a sense of hope on that, but at the same time, man, it's a really steep mountain to climb.
I think it's particularly steep because we are a people group and a culture that is prone to abstraction. It's prone to disembodying. Like that separation is there. And I think it's true that it's been going on for a couple of generations, not just ours, but our parents' generation too. And I think that to reverse this, I think is going to take a while.
Yeah, and I wish I had some research to counter that point, but I think you're right to an extent. I will say though that, and take it or leave it, because animal models don't map to humans 1-to-1, right? But in murine studies or rat-based or mouse studies, they find that it takes 1 or 2 generations. And there's in the secret sauce or the catalyst is the generation that provides nurturing, consistent care to the pups. And from my practice, when in just my experience with friends who are parents, like I know 99% of parents love their children, and they ache for their children. They're worried about them. They stress about them. They want their children to do well. The issue is not love. The issue is presence, and how, or the lack of presence that prevents us as parents from being able to see our children when they're dysregulated and not label that as my child is sinful and I need to discipline him towards obedience. Like that's the issue. We've sort of misplaced or mischaracterized some of those behaviors to this non-specific designation as sin, when if we were actually in the present moment and could attune and understand what's going on in their brains, we would see, oh, they're dysregulated because they're really disappointed about this other thing. And then they didn't get a good night of sleep. And they're hungry right now. So this is why they're throwing a tantrum in the middle of Target. Like we would have better eyes to see what's happening, and there'd be less of this sort of disconnect or fragmentation, relational fractures that happen all the time. And with parenting, it's not about perfection. In my clinic, I'll offer to parents, hey, the most important thing is not that you're perfect, or that you get it all right. The most important thing is repair. It's having the presence and the willingness and the freedom from shame to go to your child and say, you know what, son, I lost my temper. I shouldn't have yelled at you. You must have been really scared when I was yelling. And I lost control. And I'm sorry. How many of us as children ever heard sorry? Like, I think a lot of us probably think that word is not existent. It doesn't exist in our parents' vocabulary. But it is so important to model that. And I don't know, I guess when I look at the gospel and I think about the Jesus story, like, to me, every part of and how Jesus modeled interacting with each other, with others, it's crazy how much it maps so well to what is good for our physiology. It is incredible, like, how closely it mapped. Like, grace is incredibly soothing and regulating for our physiology. And there's no reason to have grace outside of a faith-based Christian context. It doesn't make sense in the secular world. It's like, you wrong me, I have every right to retaliate or to have recourse. But the idea of grace is like, that is the cycle breaker. And yeah, I guess I could go on, but I'll stop there. I mean, there's so much more to unpack around that, but all to say, I feel an urgency, and I think for me, it's just like a tension that I have to live with, because obviously this is not on my timing. But I feel so mixed about it, because I feel like I have to have an urgency in order to push. Like, we have to have an urgency in order to put this on people's radar and have it feel significant.
Don't you feel like your sense of urgency is being reciprocated? I feel like there's a rising tide of Asian American Christians who maybe they don't know the data, or they're not maybe they're not familiar with all the technical terms and phases of whatever. But I think that there's a real hunger for this. So I would imagine the movement that you're seeking is probably rising as we speak. No, you don't.
Well, I mean, I hope, like,
Hannahs don't grow on trees.
I'm encouraged at what Hannah has experienced and is a part of, and that's very local. That's happening at our church. It's when I think about the men, what's happening among men, that sometimes just feels like a wall. And yes, there are some men who do care about this, but I've also been in groups of men where it just, again, regression to the mean. It feels like all you can talk about are sports and really trivial or superficial things that don't involve any kind of vulnerability. Or, I always say, like, if people are not boring, but conversations can be boring. And the reason conversations are boring is because it's one or more people are projecting a false self. We're saying something that's a cliched statement, but there's just not something real. Like, something real is not happening in that exchange. And I've been in a lot of boring conversations. Again, not to condemn anybody.
I'm sorry, Stan. I'm really...
It's never boring with you, though.
On behalf of the boring conversations that we've had. No, I'm just kidding. I will say this. I think because it's an embodiment issue, I'm not sure conversation is always the best medium for men. I think the entree may be fishing, or it may start at the ball game. Like, it may start talking about basketball. So I think you have to wade through a lot of the small talk to get to the heart, because I think men have been ignored and we've dismissed ourselves for so long that in order for me to believe that I'm safe enough to be heard, my heart won't open. Like, you're going to have to cut through a lot of permafrost before we get through, hey, you're going to stick around? Because most of my adult friendships are pretty fair weather. And so, like, the idea of, like, crisis and this being a shared burden, I'm not sure if intellectually I'd be like, yes, we need to do this. Yes, we should. I'm ready to open up. Cognitively, yes. Emotionally, like, no, I'm not sure if I believe you. And so I say that to say, even if it feels like a wall, I would say for particularly Asian American men, I think that's part of the process. Just because there's no sign that anything's going on doesn't mean nothing's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
We've been talking for about 2 hours, and I feel like we're just, speaking of like cutting into the permafrost, like we're just getting started, but this might be enough for a sort of entree into this, and hopefully we can have more conversations like this going forward. DJ, you want to say any final words?
No, thank you. And my hope is this is a conversation starter. And to our listening audience and viewers looking over my shoulder, add a comment if you would like us to continue and what you would like us to respond to. We would love to see this permeate our generation and set up our next generation to really thrive and be a healing not for ourselves only, but for the world. That's the gospel.
Amen. And I want to push on Stan's point here is pastors, church leaders, lay leaders, it can't happen. Like healing can't happen unless you are willing to confront, encounter, and push through these awkward conversations, dark moments of going into these memories, going into these experiences, and really digging, like really excavating some of this harm and neglect, abuse, and trauma. And so if this is going to happen at the urgency and at the scale that I think, Stan, you're talking about, is we can't get there unless leaders are willing to face some of these shadow sides and dark corners of the church. And I think you're right. The church is the place where it can happen, but it can't happen unless we're willing to face it.
I can say something. Just as a worship leader, just reciprocating what you're saying. I'm thinking of the phrase that I'm quoting a phrase that Matt Redman said, you can't sing until you've seen. Mm-hmm. And you can't, for me, I could not lead Good Father until I'd seen the goodness of God as a good father. And for our leaders, ministry leaders, pastors, staff, just listeners, you can't sing or you can't say or speak out loud until you've seen.
That's good. My final thought on this, there's so much left to unpack, that's for sure. I think so one fruit of my journey of being in this space since 2015, when I first learned about it, is, and I didn't mean for this to happen, there was a period between 2015 and 2019, David knows, where I was really burned out, frustrated, and bitter at the church, especially the Asian American church. And what has happened with me learning more about this topic, understanding and making sense of my own story, and letting it impact my relationships and how I show up, it has greatly just brought me back under the wing of Jesus in a way that I never expected or anticipated or planned to happen. And part of that has also made me love the church in a way that I never expected or anticipated either. And I know I've said a lot of things here that can kind of land harshly on the church, but my intention is not to just criticize and leave it, but tell the truth from where I see it, and then be a part of the process of change. Not to critique it from afar or be bitter and sit back, but to tell the truth, embrace the challenge, and be a part of the process. I say all that because I just don't know if we can see healing in our society anywhere else outside of the church in a meaningful way. And that's not to criticize secular institutions or anything like that. Again, I go back to this concept of grace. We have the perfect model of grace through the gospel. We have every reason to embody grace towards not only people around us, but ourselves. And I think the more that we can really let grace move us, and the more it can fill our nervous system and our circulation, and the more it's in our body, the more we will see healing happen. So I know, again, so many thoughts left unsaid, but I think the church has to be a part of healing. And the Asian American church, I think, has an incredible opportunity for transformation as we continue to explore and try to understand who we are and as a community and what we're here to do. I think we have an incredible opportunity to be a catalyst for change and healing that will extend beyond the walls of an Asian American church.
Amen. Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Get this episode's show notes at our website, erasingshame.com. Subscribe to the Erasing Shame podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast app. And please add a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our message of hope and healing.